are a paper tiger and apparently don't even need to be worried about, or at least that's the view of President Donald Trump, who yesterday in a Truth Social suggested that Ukraine, because Russia is a paper tiger, should just go ahead and go back on the offensive and, in fact, drive Russia all the way back to the 1991 borders, and maybe, who knows, keep going even beyond that. President Trump has gotten lots of interest in this. A lot of people have been talking about what's going on here, but we wanted to look at this from a little bit different of a perspective today. So we have a former British diplomat, Ian Proud, who's back with us today. Used to be on the staff in the British Embassy in Moscow, so he's got a lot of direct experience about what the Russians may think, and we're going to try to get basically some translations and interpretations into what the Russian side is doing and just how accurate this issue may be of Russia as a paper tiger. First of all, Ian, welcome back to the show. Always a pleasure to have you.
Great to see you again, Danny. It's always nice to have our discussions.
Yeah, I still feel bad that the last time I was in London, you were sick and weren't able to join us for dinner, because we were really looking forward to sitting down with you. I hope we can do that again. It's a chance I might actually be back in London next month, or 2 months from now. So we'll see how
let's do it. I should come out to DC as well.
Oh, you should. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe even get Gary to fly down. That would be awesome. Listen, though, let's get this right off the bat. I mean, if anybody is ever going to be accused of being a paper tiger, one of the last entrants I would ever think anyone would bring up would be the Russian Federation. What do you make of this claim by President Trump?
In the context of his UN General Assembly speech, it's difficult to take it seriously, really. My sense is that he's growing slightly frustrated with the lack of progress. He claimed to have already ended 7 wars. He's come nowhere close to ending the war in Ukraine, sadly, despite his efforts to do so. I just feel he's getting frustrated, and he's now just kind of freelancing, a bit. I think one of the challenges he faces is that actually there's intransigence within Europe about ending the war. There's no real evidence that actually the Europeans are ready to support Zelensky in settling for a ceasefire. And from Trump's point of view, as he repeatedly says these days, the Europeans and NATO are paying for American weapons anyway, so okay, tally-ho, chaps, and so on. But I don't think he really believes, actually, that that Ukraine can push Russia out of its borders. And in fact, this slightly takes us back to April 2022, when the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss claimed the same thing, and everybody thought that she was absurd, except here we are 3 years later.
Well, it looks like they might have been right about that, about the being absurd part. Unfortunately, you can probably still apply the same title to the current president of the United States, as his comments were probably even more ludicrous than Liz Truss's may have been back then. Let's go on. You mentioned that the Europeans seem to not want to really pay attention to this. I want to show you a bit of a expanded comment from Trump, that not just what he wrote in the Truth Social, but when he was sitting down with Emmanuel Macron of France, where he again brought up the issue of the paper tiger.
3.5 years, and they've gotten not so far. So we'll see what happens. But the other side can fight too. And they've proven that. Maybe it could be that Russia's a paper tiger. I don't know what they are, but 3.5 years of fighting and killing everybody, of killing 7,000 people a week for nothing. So it's a very sad situation, but most of you have seen the recent statement I put out a little while ago. And I'm glad you got it. But I feel that way. I really do feel that way. Let them get their land back.
Yep.
So we'll see how it all works out.
Couple of things I want to talk about from that. Let's look at the last part first, where he said, just let them get their land back. Okay, Ukraine has been trying to get their land back. In fact, you could really argue the sole operational success that they had in the entire war was when they drove Russia out of Kharkiv Oblast in the north and Kherson City in the east. And since that time, it's been nothing but on the back foot. And of course, that all centered on 2023, when they did everything in their power to push Russia out of the territory it had and back to the Azov coast. And it didn't even get past the first of 5 Russian defensive lines. And ever since that time, really going back to November of 2023, Russia has been on the offensive since. So what sense then would it seem to make to tell Ukraine that now you can go and take back all the way to the 1991 borders, not even just back to the 2022 borders?
Well, Trump is right in one key aspect. I don't actually agree with him. But he is right in one aspect that very little progress has been made recently. Of course, a lot happened in the first 3 months of the war. We all understand that. But actually, the progress has been incredibly slow, really, over the past 18 months. But as you know, all of that progress has largely been on the Russian side, slowly kind of grinding out. So I think Trump is trying to say that because military progress on the ground has been so slow, that means that Russia, isn't a very strong power. But the one thing that he misses really in that argument is the fact that, from Russia's perspective, winning the war isn't about necessarily territorial gain. It's about the kind of devastating effect this is happening on Europe economically and politically through the cost of supporting a war that Ukraine cannot win. So this is the attrition part of it. I've never been convinced that Russia wants to take all of Ukraine, but what the war is doing is actually devastating. France, you see that, can't keep a government for more than 3 months. The UK is having kind of growing problems as well, spiraling debt, low growth, deindustrialization. So, I mean, from Putin's point of view, he doesn't need to make a lot of military progress because, Europe is slowly imploding before his eyes.
Well, then let's look at one of the other things that he said there. He said, and he says this, a lot of people say this too, and especially as somebody who has some experience dealing with the Russian mentality, as you did as a diplomat. He said that Russia has been killing all these people, quote, for no reason. Like there's no reason for Russia to be having this war. What do you say to that? Does Russia, at least from their perspective, have a reason to fight in this war?
Well, the one primary reason that Russia went to war was because it felt that its concerns about NATO expansion weren't being listened to. And actually, in fairness to Trump, he did say after the Alaska summit, I think possibly before the Alaska summit too, that Ukraine should not be able to join NATO. But the problem is that the Europeans haven't really lined up around that message, and nothing concrete has been put to the Russians in terms of a clear, hard and fast commitment that Ukraine will never join NATO. And actually the Russians will want that enshrined in some sort of treaty just because of the kind of very legalistic way in which the Russians tend to operate. So diplomatically, they like things on paper with lots of stamps on them. That's unfortunately just how they like to operate. But until they get something clear cut rather than an offhand remark from Trump at a press conference that Ukraine can't join NATO, that will never be enough for them. They want it set down. And when that is put on the table in front of them, I think they're going to be more likely to settle for a deal. But we seem nowhere close to getting to that point any time now, particularly with Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, continuing to kind of blather on about, NATO path being irreversible for Ukraine.
And you don't have to validate the Russian position or even agree with it, but I think that it is important to not just casually dismiss it and say there's no reason for them to fight at all, because that could leave the impression in the West that, okay, there's no real reason for them to fight. So all we got to do is find the right pressure point, and then they'll find it unpleasant enough or problematic enough that since there's no real reason, then they'll just stop fighting here. But if there is a reason, even if it's only from their perspective, and it's something that they would willing to die for or to kill for, then that changes the calculations of what you may need to do to get this over with. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about, from the Russian perspective, how big of an issue is this whole issue that led to the, quote, root causes, which they keep saying over and over, has to be solved before this to get to an end? Meaning, will Russia just keep fighting until they win, or is there a pressure point to where they can stop?
Yeah, for Russia, this is existential. Whether you agree with them on the NATO point or not, NATO spends 53% of global military expenditure and actually wants to increase that massively. So, I mean, Russia sees NATO as a direct military threat. But if you step back a bit and look at the bigger picture, I mean, Russia is the biggest country on the planet, but it doesn't actually have a very big population compared to its landmass, in fact. And it sees itself as encircled, not just on its western flank, obviously from Europe and NATO, but also don't underestimate on its eastern flank as well, where China is 10 times bigger by population and economic size. So it feels hemmed in, and history tells it that, people always like to invade Russia, whether it's Napoleon or Adolf Hitler or whoever that may be. So it is deep rooted within their psyche that this fear of encirclement, it's not just something that Putin has made up. And actually, he genuinely believes, whether we agree with him or not, that some sort of commitment was made to Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't expand east, and has continued to expand east. And even, not just in Ukraine, the Congress is still pushing for Georgia to join NATO as well. We'll talk about that perhaps some other time. But, the Russians just won't have it. And they see it as existential. And every time they've been invaded, they fought back. And actually, they've normally won. So that's, what's at stake for them.
Right. And so when you talk about what's going to cause them to change their calculations, I'm not sure that anything is going to, but putting them under more pressure would seem to me, and you tell me if you agree or disagree, that the more pressure you put Russia under and the more threats, it seems to me the more hardened they're going to get, not that the more amenable they will be to make a deal that's not in their favor.
That's exactly right. I mean, you look at the size of NATO, economically, it's 27 times bigger than Russia economically, right? It's got 3.5 times more troops, than Russia, and so on. All of these metrics suggest to NATO that it is more powerful than Russia. But what NATO doesn't have, is that unilateral power to take decisions. It's kind of running a war by committee, if you like, where Putin has the sole power, because of the system that he set up in Russia, to decide everything that his country does. Whether you like a system or don't like a system, he can actually pull the trigger on actions in the way that NATO leaders can't. So that gives him a big, actually, strategic but also tactical advantage in terms of gaming to the Europeans. And actually, every time the Europeans call another meeting and talk for weeks about possibly doing something they never quite agree to, well, Putin's already kind of ahead of the game and sort of outflanked them in some way. So, don't underestimate his ability to outsmart sort of us, not necessarily saying he's brighter than us, but also his determination not to back down, because, for him, backing down is political suicide. He spent his whole career as president telling, Russian citizens that NATO is bent on declawing the bear and all of those, tropes, and everything NATO has done seems to have confirmed his narrative. Well, if he backs down now, that's political suicide for him as well. So he's got nowhere to go apart from to fight.
Yeah, not good to push somebody in a corner who has that kind of domestic pressure on them. I want to shift over. You mentioned earlier that the Europeans have shown no interest in making any kind of concessions necessary or to do anything besides wanting to go more war. And part of that was on display at the United Nations General Assembly today with Czech President Pavel, who went on to claim that, look, there's an issue here at stake of sovereignty and of setting standards for the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, our multilateral system was created on the premise that rules apply to all without exception. The consequences of this war go far beyond the news headlines. This war threatens to dismantle our system of governance based on mutual respect, equal partnership, and rules we all subscribe to. What is happening in Europe today could happen anywhere else tomorrow, under different circumstances, but under the exact same pretext. If Russia wins this unjust war, it will legitimize the triumph of brute force. Turning a blind eye to Ukraine today is a green light to any future aggressor anywhere in the world.
Okay, so a couple of things I want to analyze there, because what he said is not unique to the Czech president. It's actually mentioned by many European leaders. The rules-based international order that he calls it, it's for mutual respect, and everybody has to benefit from it, and everyone agrees to the rules. But this is a European continent side. And by the way, whether they like it or not, that does include Russia. I don't know that there is a lot of mutual respect going on between the two. And if you don't have that, it's hard to come to any kind of agreed rules-based order when there's not mutual respect. How do you see that?
Well, firstly, there is no rules-based international order. That's a Western construct that's really come into play over the past decade since the Ukraine crisis started. What there is the United Nations Charter of 1947, I think, signed in San Francisco, and that's really talks about the indivisibility of security. Of course, everybody understands the concept of sovereignty. That is entirely clear. But I mean, from Russia's point of view, the rules have been broken against them as well. Of course, they have broken the rules. They've invaded Ukraine, and that is wrong. I consider it to be wrong, and so on. But, you need to understand that the Russians feel that the rules have been broken against them as well. And that's what they're fighting for. So it's fine to sit behind the comfort blanket of saying, well, this is bad and Russia's bad and it's all wrong, but that won't end the war. And ultimately, if this carries on, Europe is going to slowly implode upon itself, because it will keep funding a war that it can't afford, and social unrest across the continent will rise, as we've seen in France, more recently in the UK as well, and Germany.
And so the other part of his comments there were basically that if this stands, if Russia's naked aggression stands, which is a statement used by so many in the West throughout the beginning of this, unprovoked attack, then that will be a signal to tyrants everywhere. But from the Russian perspective, they seem to view this almost in a mirror image, in that it was what they view as the aggression of the West into Ukraine. And I'm not talking about 2022. I'm talking about 2014, when they installed a ruler that's happy to the West, that they like, overturning the guy who was legally elected by the rules-based order and won a legal election, but they was friendly to the Russian side. They helped overthrow him and put someone else in there. And to Russia, that was the original sin, which eventually led to the war here. Does the Russian side have a position here, or is that just them revisionist history?
Well, I think that's, I mean, everybody will interpret it, in different ways, right? You need to kind of look at the facts on the ground. I mean, I agree with that sort of assessment that the West, in particular, that the US, but also actually the UK, but essentially sanctioned an illegal coup against an elected leader in Ukraine. And the reason for that is actually because after he kind of fled the presidential palace, I think it's the 22nd of February 2014, 23rd, he eventually ended up in Russia on the 24th, I believe, which incidentally is the anniversary of when war broke out in 2022, but that's another matter. The Verkhovna Rada, the kind of parliament in Ukraine, voted, to impeach him, but the vote tally was less than required by the Ukrainian constitution to oust the president. And so that convinced, the Russians that actually this was an illegal thing, because it was unconstitutional the way the Verkhovna Rada, sidetracked their constitutional requirements for impeachment to actually allow him to be impeached with a lower vote tally. Now, if you step back to your bigger question about kind of what that means for Russia and its narrative in the wider developing world, I mean, what we have seen is, the developing world with Russia, China, India, and other countries, through the BRICS grouping, has really accelerated over the past, 3 years. The developing countries are really worried about, NATO, about us in the West, about this kind of hegemon of this massive military alliance, which takes up over 53% of total defense spending in the world, and wants to spend even more, and wants to kind of punish and sanction, countries, wants to kind of steal their assets. I'm afraid that is a narrative that is gaining a lot of traction in the developing world, and that is what is boosting, BRICS. That is what is undoubtedly kind of boosting China's popularity too, and Putin is definitely riding on the back of that.
Yeah, so it's ironic that we're trying to demonize the Russians here, and in the process, we might be demonizing ourselves in the eyes of those we're trying to influence. But that's one of the unintended consequences of some of these actions here. I want to look also in the United States here. So I believe it was yesterday at the United Nations Security Council, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio sent a pretty strong warning to Russia on the heels of President Trump's Truth Social.
He also has before him the option, as he has already chosen to do in some circumstances, to sell defensive weaponry and potentially offensive weaponry so that Ukraine can defend itself from this assault by purchasing that weaponry. So I'm here to say to the Security Council, the United States remains as committed as it has ever been to a peaceful resolution to this dangerous conflict. But there will come a moment in which we will have to conclude that perhaps there is no interest in a peaceful resolution. And then the president has before him real options, which he intends to pursue, as he has made clear today in some of the messages he has put out. This war needs to end. But if it does not, if there is no path to peace in the short term, then the United States and President Donald J. Trump will take the steps necessary to impose costs for continued aggression.
See, now there's a big problem because they keep saying, both the United States and Europe and certainly the Ukrainians, that Russia's not interested in peace, that they don't want to have a negotiated settlement. But that's not entirely accurate. As it turns out, that Russia is very much interested in peace. They have been looking to get diplomacy all the way through this, but there is a huge difference in the terms that each side wants to have. Now, Rubio is sitting here saying, as the leader in the United States, and presumably most of Europe is behind him, that Russia has to agree to our terms. Or if they don't agree to our terms, then we'll do this the hard way, as some put it, and we'll go not just defensive weaponry, but maybe offensive weaponry. How are the Russians going to interpret that?
Well, before I sort of go into that question, I mean, I think the biggest message I heard from that statement by Rubio was that we, the Americans, are going to sell Ukraine more weapons. I didn't hear anything about giving them free weapons, which kind of goes back to my earlier point about, actually, from Trump's point of view, this is just a massive opportunity for the defense industrial complex in the kind of USA. What I also didn't hear was actually, well, what does Ukraine actually need to put on the table as well to kind of compromise and reach some sort of deal with Russia? You never really hear about that. I mean, no pressure is put on Ukraine to kind of settle in some way, while it continues to bussify young men from the streets in the way that we wouldn't accept in our own countries and send them straight to the front line. So, I mean, I think actually they're the two kind of big messages I got loud and clear from that, which is actually a pretty limp-wristed offer by the United States, basically to kind of sell more weapons to a country that's already essentially bankrupt, which is...
Yeah, now, let me ask you, how is that playing in Europe? Right? Obviously, you're not exactly swimming in cash as a continent and a European Union. And now that they hear that, yeah, Trump's willing to provide weaponry, but at a premium price that you have to pay for. How is that playing in Europe?
Well, I think there's a difference between European mainstream elites, which seem to be going along with a plan and saying, well, yes, not only will we just gullibly buy all of your weapons, oh, Donald J. Trump, but we'll also increase defense spending to 5%, from, for example, in the situation of France, a position where we're practically bankrupt anyway, but we'll add on another 75 billion euros of defense spending every year as well over the next 10 years. So it's actually... it's real head in the sand stuff, I'm afraid to say. And to go back to your earlier question about what does Putin think about this? Well, he's just sat back watching it all unfold, which goes back to my earlier point about the attritional nature of this war. Don't just judge a war by miles gained on the battlefield, although there's slow creeping progress by the Russian army. I mean, Putin is watching Europe fall apart before his eyes, and he's rubbing his hands, thinking, "Well, great, who's winning now?"
Oh, yeah, I think that could pretty much stop at that point right there. I want to move on to the Ukrainian position here. Now, if you had both Rubio and Trump and Macron talking about how Russia doesn't want to negotiate, Zelensky is saying, well, part of the reason is because Vladimir Putin is afraid to talk to me.
The Russian representatives is here, but of course not the one who makes the real decisions. That man fears to sit face to face with Ukraine and the world and openly admit he wants only war. Instead, Putin sends delegates who cannot and don't want to stop the bloodshed. And when he appears abroad in Beijing or somewhere else, it's only to buy more time for killing, pretending he seeks diplomacy. Putin only cares about using every meeting, every chance to keep the war going. Each day Russia kills our people, destroys our cities, and leaves no sign it will ever return to the principles of the UN Charter. China is also represented here, a powerful nation on which Russia now depends completely. If China truly wanted this war to stop, it could compel Moscow to end the invasion. Without China, Putin's Russia is nothing. Yet too often, China stays silent and distant instead of active for peace. The United States of America is present here as well.
We ran that clip a little bit longer so you could have seen the Chinese diplomat there was not looking too happy. And I'm going to ask your opinion from a diplomatic perspective. What are the chances that in the United States Security Council that the Chinese representative is going to be coerced by these, stern words from President Zelensky that you guys are kind of the impediment here? You could stop him if you want to. I can only imagine that he would have said that if he thought that somehow that China would go, okay, gosh, I'm embarrassed now. Okay, we'll go ahead and turn against Russia. What do you make of that?
Honestly, Danny, I really don't know what to say. I mean, this guy is an unelected leader of a bankrupt country that has had almost 6 million of its citizens flee, 3.9 million internally displaced within the country, cities shattered, almost 1 million killed or injured, during the course of the war. And he's actually telling arguably the largest economy in the world by purchasing power parity, i.e. China, what to do. I mean, this is the ultimate showman, and the thing is, what really makes it almost comedic, but in a really dark and cynical way, I'm afraid to say, is he's talking about Russia not wanting to sit down at the table. The European nations have made a point of refusing to talk to Vladimir Putin since 2014. There is no table for him to sit at. It's only President Trump, to his great credit, who actually agreed to sort of break that impasse by inviting Putin to, Alaska, fairly recently. I mean, the Europeans refused to talk to Putin. I mean, this is then saying that Putin won't talk to us is clearly absurd, because the Russians do want to negotiate, but actually, the Europeans, and of course Zelensky, because he's quite comfortable in his position with his corrupt entourage around him, his citizens dying, cities being destroyed, to keep carrying on in his role, because he can't take up comedy when this is over, can he?
Yeah, I mean, we say that it would be comedic if not for the darker side that his comedy results in his own people being killed in large numbers for no hope, no possibility of actually reversing anything. And I guess that's really the irony, if not the perversity of all this. But in the sense of comedic, there was the view from Russia. We wonder what the Chinese might be thinking. We don't have to wonder what the Russians are thinking, at least not one. Sergei Markov, who is a confidant of Vladimir Putin, is on a lot of American and Western media, because he's kind of able to talk about what's going on here. He had his interesting comment today. I'll just play you a bit of it here, where he's explaining what he thinks Russia really believes about this statement from Putin, from Trump, about the paper tiger thing.
First of all, I was very much surprised, because Donald Trump was talking absolutely contrary things during last 2 years. But then when I look more carefully, I understand that Donald Trump was joking. It was his joke to Zelensky, because on the meeting, as I know, Zelensky told Donald Trump, look, Ukrainian army is very strong, Ukrainian army is going forward, Ukrainian army now ready to have hit to Russian army. And look, we stop gasoline station working in Russia, Russian economy in trouble, and so on. And Donald Trump, who absolutely doesn't believe to the Zelensky, Donald Trump, by joking, said him, look, you really believe that you can crush Russian army who crashed Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler? Go ahead.
So I thought that was, if you think you can do that, if you're better than Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler, give that a try. What do you make of that comment?
I think there's a lot in that, actually, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm not sure I completely took Trump's statement seriously myself. I don't believe that he really thinks that Ukraine could achieve that military success. And actually, Putin is the same. Putin loves to kind of pull people's chains, in ways that kind of annoys them through his dark kind of Russian humor. And I see a bit of that in Trump too. So, I mean, I think that there is a certain grain of truth to that indeed. And of course it drives, it simultaneously drives, policymakers crazy, but at the same time, you see the Europeans lapping up this gospel. Oh gosh, he's, the Messiah has returned. He's turned back from the bad path, and now he's come back to, the path of total victory against Russia again. So totally mixing up that metaphor. I apologize. But I mean, it's just like the Europeans love this. Oh my God, Trump really believes that Ukraine can win. And so I think Trump is also kind of just happy to watch Europe die, frankly. I mean, America is becoming great again. I love America. I hope to come back soon. Maybe I could live there. And he's watching the Europeans, who are in some respects a strategic competitor to the US, right, economically, collapse before his eyes, and maybe he's quite happy to watch it unfold as well as Putin is.
Well, that's an interesting possibility there. I guess I couldn't put anything past him. There is one thing though, where, okay, all humor aside, they could turn dark in a decidedly bad way. And that was when the whole issue started coming up of all of these air incursions, alleged air incursions into multiple NATO states, whether that's drones or MiG-31s, et cetera. And a lot of this comment started coming up is, should the European side shoot down the Russian jets, which of course is an act of war, and you could literally explode this thing into a state-on-state fight outside of the Ukraine, which would be catastrophic for everyone, because the possibility of nuclear weapons obviously becomes very much into play at that point. And when Trump was asked about this in a recent interview, he said this.
Do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace?
Yes, I do.
What do you think? How would Russia digest that statement?
Well, number one, it's common sense coming from the president. We talked about this in my first Security Council meeting, which was just Monday, that the Estonians called. And between the violations of Romanian airspace, Polish airspace, and now Estonian airspace, I think Putin, the Russians, should take the message from the president. He's not messing around. He's incredibly serious. The Iranians learned painfully that he will use sticks as well as carrots.
Okay, so let's just take, again, the last part of that first. Making any kind of an analogy between Iran and Russia doesn't seem like the best place to start a conversation.
No, not really. But I mean, I think there's something here about kind of, rules of engagement, really. The Russians do like to push the boundaries. We know that. And there's precedent here for, I think it was 2016, when the Turkish Air Force shot down a Russian jet as it crossed Turkish airspace from Syria. I don't know if you recall that, but that was a really big thing at the time. And I think actually NATO, if they, rather than talking about it in press conferences, that they should, they should send a signal to the Russians that the rules of engagement have changed, and if there are any further incursions by your jets, and that they will be fired upon. And I think if that statement is made clear, then actually I think it just, it will fix in the minds of the Russians clearly that actually that they should maybe hold back from pushing that boundary again. But the question is whether NATO would then follow through with that. And I think one of the reasons that the Russians like to do this is because they believe that NATO is weak and they won't fire back. So I do think there's an argument for NATO actually saying, well, if this were to happen again with your identified military aircraft crossing into our space, we will fire upon you. I think. Well,
that's actually what Foreign Minister Sikorski from Poland did say. I think it was at a UN Security Council meeting on these incursions, and he did say, "You have been warned." He looked right at his Russian counterpart in the council meeting.
But that's not really the same thing, though, is it? That's not really mil contacts where the kind of NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe is actually sending a message to his Russian counterpart that actually we'll have weapons for you to kind of fire on you if you do this again. Some politician lightweight like Sikorski, showboating in a press conference. That's not really the same thing, I don't think. This needs to be military to military contact happening here. If that's, and I think actually, in terms of escalating to de-escalate, that might not be an unhelpful conversation actually to have.
But let's look at just at the surface level stuff. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that Poland meant that was their military and political leadership decision. I mean, that would be a major, major risk on the Polish side to say, if you just venture into our airspace, we're going to fire on your jet, which could spark a literal international event. I mean, what are the risks there?
Well, the risks are massive, but I don't actually believe the Polish meant that at all. I mean, Sikorsky is such a kind of plasticine-spined kind of creature that I don't, believe that they've
Don't
done.
hold back what you actually think about him. Just let it go.
They've done everything in their power to avoid even shooting missiles over Ukrainian airspace. The Polish have done everything to avoid getting inveigled into this war, and I see absolutely no sign of that changing. They have an odd position on the war, Poland, because they know that actually, when war ends, Ukraine will be pushing to join Europe, and if Ukraine does join Europe, then Poland sets to lose billions of euros every year in farming subsidies. So I mean, I think that the Poles are kind of slippery, frankly, on this. But I don't actually believe that Radek Sikorsky kind of showboating in a press conference genuinely means that the Poles were about to kind of shoot, Russian drones in that case, or aircraft out of the sky.
Well, you say that there's a lot of risk here because obviously any time you have nuclear weapons that are involved, and Russia keeps reminding people of this, they have been throughout this conflict. And that happened again, I think, a couple of days ago when President Putin addressed some concerns that he had. If we showed Czech President Pavel talking about he's worried about the international rules-based order, Russian President Vladimir Putin is worried about the strategic balance.
The multiple problems that have accumulated in the strategic sphere since the beginning of the 21st century we associate with the destructive actions of the West, their destabilizing doctrinal concepts and military technical programs aimed at undermining global parity, at attempting to achieve absolute overwhelming superiority. We have consistently and in detail dwelt on these issues, criticized this position, not only emphasize the extreme danger of the further degradation of the situation, but also repeatedly put forward concrete ideas for its joint correction. However, our warnings and initiatives have not received a clear response. I emphasize, and in this no one should have any doubt, Russia is capable of responding to any existing and newly emerging threats, responding not in words, but by means of applying military technical measures.
That last phrase here is got my attention, by applying military technical measures, because that is verbatim what they said prior to launching their military operation, what now they call the special military operation in Ukraine prior to February 2022. Is if you were accusing basically Sikorsky, what's his face? Sorry, the Polish foreign minister, of being rhetorical and not really meaning what he said there, could the same thing apply to Putin? Is he just rattling people's cages, or do you think that he would actually consider using nuclear weapons under certain circumstances?
Under certain circumstances, I think he would. I don't think we're anywhere that far up the kind of escalation ladder to the point where he would. We're approaching the 1-year anniversary of his use of the Oreshnik missile, hypersonic missile, against a munitions factory in Ukraine, if you recall, and that was a tremendous example of him taking 2 steps up the escalation ladder. But he believes that he will escalate more than the Europeans, and he has escalation dominance. I don't think we're yet at the point of actually that resorting to
and certainly that's the case. I mean, militarily, he's definitely on the position of significant authority. The tempo is in his favor, and the momentum, everything. And will that being the case, then why did he make this point of publicly making that statement? What's his intent?
Well, because he likes to do that all the time. He likes to kind of send the fear of God into the kind of weakling Europeans as he I think sees them. And actually there's an element of concern there too, that he does worry about the rising rhetoric from the West about shooting down Russian aircraft and so on. Of course that's true, but then by the same token they shouldn't fly into kind of European airspace either, frankly. So I mean I think he's just kind of setting it out there, as he did last year before he launched the Oreshniks, do recall at that time that, you know, when there was discussion about escalating on the NATO side by actually having some medium range kind of cruise missiles kind of used deeper inside of Russia. That's, you know, NATO's looking to escalate now. He's responding in this way as he did exactly the same way in November of last year.
Do you have any sense, and obviously this would be a state secret, so we can't be certain, but have you heard any evidence to say how many Oreshnik missiles does Russia have now? If they tested it in operation about a year ago, how many have they produced since?
I don't have data on how many more they produced. I know they had a relatively small stockpile when they used them last year, but we do know in macro terms that actually Russia is significantly outperforming the West, not just in terms of kind of standard munitions, artillery shells and that sort of stuff, but also in terms of cruise and hypersonic missile capabilities too, and actually ships and submarines as well as that. So that across all kind of theatres of military production, they're kind of outproducing significantly Europe and NATO right now. But on specifically on the Oreshnik, no, I don't know. But I mean, clearly they have a few sort of you know, in the cupboard should they decide to use them. I mean, the question is, you know, and this exact same question, if you recall, came up last year. You know, will the Russians fire into the kind of military logistical hub in Poland? You know, if Taurus missiles, they didn't get deployed, but you know, Storm Shadow and Atom's kind of fire deep into Russia. Exactly the same conversations were happening. So there's a slight sense of yet again deja vu, you know, here, and Putin is just reminding people of what he did last time.
Yeah, so that's I mean, obviously we no one's going to know for that, but it seems reasonable to presume, given their production capacity and all these other categories you mentioned, that it's likely that there are some decent number of them. But evidence suggests that we probably could not defend against them, so let's don't find out, I guess is a good point there. Last thing I want to talk about on this subject here goes back to Crimea. You may recall during the 2023 offensive the Ukraine side had in the months prior to that, one of the big statements that Zelensky was making and Ben Hodges kept saying over and over was that Ukraine was going to drive to the Azov coast and then eventually cut off that land bridge and then turn and take Crimea. In fact, Ben Hodges routinely said that they were going to take Crimea back by the end of 2023, by the end of August 2023 to be specific. He said that on a couple of occasions. Didn't quite work out, but you haven't really heard much about Crimea since. In fact, in the last week, all we've heard about is that the current line of contact is where negotiations need to start, and then they'll figure it out from there. Well, for some reason, Volodymyr Zelensky decided he was going to bring Crimea back to the spotlight.
And we are taking action to prevent Russia from turning Crimea into one large military base. And we have to do this to protect the lives of our people. Our long-range drones are accurate. Our pressure on Russia logistics is producing results. And the Russian war machine is facing very serious difficulties. It's vital that the world keeps in mind the suffering of civilians whose lives Russia has destroyed in the occupied territories. And today, repression is the harshest in Crimea and other areas under Russian control for speaking the truth, for wanting freedom, even for faith.
That's good enough right there, Gary. So why do you suppose he's bringing up now and saying, oh, well, they're being repressed there, so the world has to stop it? I mean, the world is not going to do anything in Crimea. That's the last on anybody's radar. Why bring that up now?
Well, the Ukrainians have had this kind of Crimea, I think it's called, form really since Zelensky kind of came to power, to kind of really keep the discussion on Crimea on the, you know, on the kind of front foot, really. But I mean, you know, I've got Russian friends. You know, I do still have Russian friends, you know, sue me, but you know, who've been on holiday to Crimea since the war, you know, has started. I mean, I don't get a palpable. I've not been to Crimea, a palpable sense that actually people are being repressed. The people there, even if the vote was illegal, I understand that, you know, voted overwhelmingly to kind of you know, secede from Ukraine. I mean, it's a majority kind of ethnic Russian and Russian-speaking population in Crimea. Stalin did the job by clearing out the Tatars during his reign of terror. We all understand that too. So I mean, I don't think there's any evidence that people in Ukraine want to Crimea, want to rejoin Ukraine. This is just another kind of Zelensky fantasy to keep the war sort of going on. Quite frankly, I mean, it's quite ridiculous. And in any case, Ukraine doesn't have the military capabilities. And of course, the bigger issue right now, he's talking about. I think Ukraine has had some success in eroding, Russian sort of all refinery capabilities recently, for example. But we're also soon approaching the winter, when yet again, I fear we're going to see a major assault on Ukrainian, power stations and so on, and more Ukrainians are going to be having another cold winter because Zelensky doesn't want to end the war, I fear.
Yeah, it's there's certainly been lots of talk about that, and there's no reason to think Russia wouldn't do it this year when they've done it nearly every other year heading into winter, and it's always caused a lot of problems. Listen, in the last bit of time here that we have you before we let you go, I want to shift gears over to the Middle East a little bit, because that's kind of been overshadowed by a lot that's going on here in the Russia-Ukraine war, but it is still on the minds of a lot of people, and that is on the Palestinian issue. And at that same conversation that I showed you earlier, where Trump was sitting down with Macron, they were talking about issues of the Russian war. Well, they also talked toward the end of that conversation about Palestine. And the American position has been through Caroline Leavitt, our spokesperson, a couple of days back, said that President Trump thinks it's a bad idea, that it's not going to help, it's going to make it more difficult. But one of the reporters asked the question of Macron, who seemed pretty insistent on sharing his different view.
Why yesterday 11 countries did recognize Palestine? Not as, it was not a decision taken like that, neither by UK, nor by Canada, nor by France. It's just a big change. President Trump is totally right. Nobody forgets the 7th of October. I went there a few days after, taking families in my hands, and we experienced all together these horrific attacks. And by the way, we lost a lot of French people in these terrorist attacks. But after almost 2 years of war, what is the result? Once again, they killed the top leaders of Hamas. It works. This is a great achievement. But at the same time, you have as many Hamas fighters as you had the first day. So it doesn't work to dismantle the Hamas. This is not the right way to proceed. So we need a full-fledged process, and we worked very hard on the day after, and I totally share this sequencing. The release of all hostages, the ceasefire, the resume of humanitarian aid, the day after in Gaza to stabilize the land, and we need a political perspective, and this is why we took this decision on recognition.
So he brought forth an issue there which gets far too little notice, and that is, and this is something I warned about literally the first weeks of this war, that Israel had embarked upon a political path to achieve a military outcome, which was the destruction of Hamas and peace for the people of Israel. I said it's not going to work. I personally observed it when our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that especially in Afghanistan, the more military force we brought in there, the more Taliban we killed, the more Taliban that were created as a result. And that was the case as we ended up there. There was, I want to say 2,000 in 2005, the first time I went there. And then there was about 20,000 when I went back in 2010. And then when we finally pulled out, it was around 75,000. And that included all this big buildup that we had. So I've seen it graphically play out, and that's exactly what we've seen here. And so now then, however many Hamas people allegedly have been killed, on top of, all the tens of thousands of innocent civilians, there are now as many Hamas fighters now people have taken up mantle when they fall down, because that's how those things work. That being the case, then, as we approach now the 2-year mark on this inconsequential war, or this inconclusive war, where can this go? Because it looks to me like that Israel is on a path that they don't want to militarily win because they can't. Then that means they're either going to have to admit defeat, or they're going to keep going until they literally, one way or the other, remove all of the people in Palestine from the Gaza Strip area. How do you see that playing out?
Well, actually, Trump spoke about that, didn't he? When he came to power, having sort of Trump Towers on the Gaza kind of Riviera, in quite a disgusting way, if I may say so. Look, I'm a Christian, and I don't, I've got Jewish friends, I've got some Muslim friends. I think what the problem with the situation in Palestine, which actually in some respects is the same problem that we have in Ukraine, is that kind of Western leaders, and particularly the Americans, but also kind of the British and Europeans until quite recently, actually, in Palestine, have wanted to side with one side of the conflict over the other, and that's been Israel. Over the knees of the Palestinians. And everybody understands the horrific nature of what happened on October the 7th, totally unconscionable acts, and the perpetrators, if they're not already dead, sadly may never face justice. But ultimately, if you want to kind of resolve this, there has to be a process that aims to ensure a situation where Jewish people feel safe and Palestinian sort of Muslims feel safe too. And unless that there's that kind of political process, it doesn't matter what military force you bring to bear. As you correctly say, military action just radicalizes a population as it did in Afghanistan, as it's doing now in Palestine. And there's a really good movie a few years ago about the Munich terrorist attack, where there's those people going to kill the Israeli athletes at the Olympic Games, and the efforts by Mossad then to track them down, including, it could be happening today, the telephone bombs, like pager bombs and that kind of stuff happened more recently. It's almost like a rerun. But what that did at the time was just radicalize the Palestinian cause as it's doing today. It's amazing, frankly, how quickly we forget the lessons of the past. The only way to resolve this is to kind of work for a solution that works for all sides. And that is something the Americans, I'm afraid, still aren't doing, I fear. And, gladly, the Europeans, even if they're blind on Ukraine policy, are starting to move in that positive direction. But I feel it's come far too late, given the thousands of innocent people and children who've been starved to death and who've died.
Yeah. That's unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about the past, and one can only hope that it's the Europeans in this case that drag the U.S. onto the right side, and we'll have to wait and see how that works out. But in any case, thank you so much for your insights here today, especially on both these conflicts going on in the two different parts of the world. We're very grateful to you, and thank you for coming on.
Great to see you again, Danny. Let's do this again soon.
Let's do. Thank you very much for joining us today, folks. Appreciate you coming on. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that before you leave. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.